The Bewitched Backsliders. You're going to love this. Hello, I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter, author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. Chili. It's like, when did we start having chili cook-offs in Halloween? I know it's getting chillier, but yeah, it's a weird association. So we're here not to horse around, but to talk about the gospel, the bewitched backsliders in Galatia. So let's do some background. New book, as always. Read the Bible Dictionary summary. Then you go through, read the chapter headings. You go through, mark the Joseph Smith translation changes, and then you read the book. So by the time you go in there, you actually read it. You've read through the book a couple of times. You know what's going on. So it's a smaller book. We're getting to the smaller epistles. You can read it in one setting if you lock the door. And so, some background. Galatia is in central Turkey. A lot of these letters are written to people in the country we now call Turkey. And back then, Turkey was a colony from Greece, and you have people like Thales from Miletus were Greek by ethnicity, language, and culture, but they're living in Turkey at the time. They came back and had an influence. I think that's interesting with the colonial aspect of Greece, because you have the same thing in the Book of Mormon with the Xenophites, how you have this colony breaks off. What comes back from the colony is Alma the Younger, Alma the Elder, and then you have the people King Mosiah, which was the people back in Zarahemla, but you have Abinadi, Alma the Younger, coming back and changing the Nephite culture. That's interesting as you see how colonies affect the mother countries. And you see this here in Galatia, also in the Book of Mormon. So that's kind of a weird tangent, but Galatia in central Turkey. Now here's the funny thing. The name Galatia comes from Gaul. These were actually Celts from the area of France, and they moved to Turkey. That's kind of interesting. So we're dealing with some interesting ethnic changes or ethnic diversity in the church, some very strange places. So you have these Jews converted now Christians talking to displaced people from France. So it's an interesting mix. And the problem is they were bewitched backsliders, and that's what the bewitched is Paul the term that Paul uses. So we're learning in this section. Let's do this topically. We learn a little bit about Paul's life and background, about his calling to be an apostle. And he has to keep asserting his validity as an apostle. He did not rush into being a church leader as he went to Arabia for about 3 years. He took some preparation time. Later, when he came back and he's meeting with Peter and James, there's this interesting issue where he had to confront Peter and James. What was going on is Peter got the revelation, it's in the book of Acts, where eating kosher animals, it's okay. You can start accepting Gentiles in the church. You need to do missionary work among the Gentiles. Plus also it's okay to you don't have to keep kosher anymore. You can eat shrimp and pork chops and bacon. It's okay now. But what happened is when Paul was visiting them, James had some people who were Jews or Judaizers, and they're eating, and so Peter broke away from the Gentiles and had dinner or had a meal with the Jewish people that were or the Judaizers, or the people who were Jewish, still keeping the kosher law. And Paul confronted him and said, "Look, you're not doing this right. It's okay to eat with Gentiles. It's okay not to keep kosher. You're the one who got the revelation." And it's a bit puzzling. We just have this one source here on what happened, so that limits our ability to get a really good handle on what's going on. And like I said, I think it's a little bit odd because Peter himself had the vision about it, but it was a struggle. And you read about this in this letters about the Jews still wanting to keep the law of Moses. But the question of confrontation: when do you confront a leader? Section 28, verse 6 says, "And thou shalt not command him who is at thy head," and at the head of the church. That, you understand there's a hierarchy. You don't get revelation for the prophet. There's a certain scope of authority and a limitation to whatever your calling is. Also, section D and C 4288 says this: "And if thy brother or sister offend thee, thou shalt take him or her between him or her and thee alone. And if he or she confess, thou shalt be reconciled. So it's a little bit awkward. Instead of using the generic he, it's using he or she. And I guess just for clarity's sake, that you have a member who offends you, you're supposed to go them aside in private, alone, and discuss it and hash it out, and not do it publicly. So Paul was commanding him who was as his head, and he did it publicly instead of privately. And so there's some issues with Paul's approach here. On the other hand, we read 2 Samuel chapter 2 about Eli, how his sons were out of control and corrupting things. You have a need to speak up. And here's some other things to think about too. King David and King Saul. Saul was a very bad king. He went from being a seer to holding a seance. And then you have this issue with Paul and Peter. And so how do you confront a leader over an issue? But Paul may have not been the correct approach. It was a good thing to bring up this issue. Like, okay, you're backsliding. You're not supposed to be doing this. Paul was certainly more expert in things than Peter was in the matter of law, having actually studied it, whereas Peter was a fisherman. But his approach, from what I gather, wasn't a correct approach. He could have handled it differently, although he was in the right. The approach was wrong. So you have the approach and then how you handle the problem. Another thing, too, we learn about Paul is his eyesight. Galatians 4:15, you read this very unusual sentence where Paul says, if you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me. And then 6 verse 11, Paul mentioned that he's writing very large letter. And you see, Paul had some eyesight problem. I mean, he was smitten with blindness, he was healed, but even after healed, he still ran the risk of getting a disease again. And so Paul's eyesight seemed to be fading at this point. And here's another thing too, is I should have put this up a little bit earlier with so I apologize for this being out of order. Is you have this conflict with the law of Moses and the law of the gospel. And then in chapter 3, verse 19, Paul mentions that the law of Moses was added because of transgression. So the law of gospel is higher, and he added, so you had to keep the law of the gospel. You had to keep the law of Moses on top of the law of the gospel. And it was added just because things were just so out of control, they couldn't handle stuff, so God had to give them the law of Moses. Now it was better than no law, and it was done under priesthood authority, but it was added because of transgression. So, next theme, this is point 3 in my outline, focusing on a thematic approach to the book of Galatians instead of doing a chapter by chapter. Paul has to use analogies to explain this difference between the law of the gospel and the law of Moses. So one is he talks about Abraham. So was Abraham justified by keeping the law of Moses or by the law of faith? Well, the law of Moses hadn't been given in Abraham's day, so it's impossible for him to do that. And you focus on faith instead of the church's obedience school. You're not getting sent to obedience school to master certain behaviors. You're here to live by faith. And that's where he's trying to drive this into the Galatians, saying, look, I'm talking about sometimes things hard to understand, so I'm going to use a series of analogies. Now, the other analogy that Paul uses is Abraham's wives. You have Sarah and Hagar. So Sarah was the mother of Isaac, who is the heir, and symbolized with New Jerusalem. You have Hagar, or Agar, as I think it's written in the Greek. You have the H. You have some letter problems. If you saw Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you understand with the J and the I. You also have it with H. So Hagar, who is an Egyptian, the mother of Ishmael, and that was associated with Sinai. And so Paul says, okay, law of gospel is Hagar. The law of Moses is Hagar. Law of the gospel is Isaac. And then he uses a third analogy, likening the law of Moses to a child who is under a guardianship or a conservatorship, that you have this child and he has governors and tutors and teachers to manage things. But when the child becomes of age, you set these tutors and governors and you get out of the conservatorship or the guardianship and you become an adult when you reach the majority. And he says that's what the law of gospel is like. You've reached your majority. You're a full-grown adult now. You don't have to act like a kid or be a kid or need these subsidiary things to keep the gospel. So just let go of it. Stop being what's called the Peter Pan syndrome, where you're just stuck as a kid all the time and not accepting adult responsibility. So that's how Paul tries to bring things across to the Galatians. Don't backslide. How did you get bewitched to the point where you can't see things right? Paul also, in addition to this, Paul talks about Christian liberty. Now, that's a term that was coined by Martin Luther, and he had a pamphlet, which I've read a couple of times, called On Christian Liberty. So the expression isn't really in there in the scriptures, but you see some expressions that suggest it, is that you no longer have to keep the law of Moses or these weird sets of things that are added to the gospel, people's plans or approaches or techniques to living the gospel. Don't do that. You have to do this. For example, growing up in the Oakland area, we'd have a ward temple night once a month. Now, nor in the scriptures that say you have to go to the temple once a month. It's all the counsel has been according to as your circumstances and time allow. But is it once a month? Is it once a week? Is it twice a week? Are you getting out of control? And sometimes it may be a month-by-month thing. Sometimes you get crazy months. Like this month, I had an unusual month with some 3 doctor's appointments. Had something else. It was just 3 doctor's appointments. So that was kind of a crazy month. But on the other hand, sometimes you have good months. And don't get caught up with people have these techniques or approaches. Same thing, too, with general conference prep. And how much of general conference prep involves preparing food instead of preparing yourself to receive revelation. So Christian liberty, take it, don't abuse it. Now, hopefully I've spent 11 minutes talking about some secondary things. We understand we have this term that's exaltation, that we're here to become exalted and become like God is. And this idea actually is part of Christianity. Most of you were exposed to this when you read C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. He has this chapter on becoming little gods. And it's in there in Christianity, but not in Western. By Western, I mean Protestantism and Catholicism. In Eastern Christianity, that is Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, the Orthodox churches, it's very obvious and emphatic. In fact, as a member of the church, sometimes I feel embarrassed how we shy away from it and how bold people are in Eastern Orthodox to talk about their belief in God. And they don't understand it the exact same way that we do, but it's a similar idea. So as you're reading this, Paul uses some expressions. For example, chapter 2, verse 20, Christ lives in me. 3:27, he talks about putting on Christ. Well, these are scriptures talking about exaltation, the process of becoming exalted, how it starts here in mortality, comes to fruition in the afterlife after the resurrection. Putting on Christ, actually in the Greek, that's not a good translation. The better translation is to be clothed or invested or endued with Christ. And that's how other translations do it. I'm put on Christ as clothing. And the expression endowment, you see that in Luke 24:49, where as before Christ is taken to heaven, he says you'll be endued with power. You'll be invested or clothed with power. Well, in our dispensation, in the early records of the church, we have the expression endowment and endowment. And I did a search on the Joseph Smith papers, and endowment and endowment are used interchangeably. And it's interesting because with endowment, that refers to putting on. Endowment means a gift, but endowment means clothing. And you understand temple worship and clothing. Yeah, there's a lot of clothing involved with worshiping the temple. Joseph Smith papers has about 20 times the expression endowment is used, or clothing, or putting on clothing. And I put a link here so you can double check my research. That's interesting. He's talking about exaltation and principles associated with the endowment. Chapter 4, verse 19, talks about Christ being formed in you. That's talking about exaltation again. So he's not doing this overtly, but he's talked about ideas that at least I would understand to be referring to principles of exaltation, theosis, that we can become like God, Christ forming in us. Don't shy away from this. Don't shy away from the second comforter, getting your calling and election made sure. Those are all principles of the gospel. Don't shy away from exaltation. It's in there. We need to understand it, and we don't need to be embarrassed by it. We don't change it to fit in with some other people. So I'm at 14 minutes. So let me hurry up and get to the Christ Quotient, and then I can enjoy my chili. So the Christ Quotient. What's your faith journey like right now? Are you like Paul? Do you need to take some time off and go to Arabia? Are you preparing yourself, or are you just rushing into callings? Just being this helter-skelter, frantic, okay, let's just hold a meeting and hand out assignments, or are you studying doctrine? Like I said, take some time to slow down, take a Sabbath from the church. Monday's a good day to take a Sabbath from some of your church work to focus on yourself so you're not doing. It sounds counterproductive, but it's actually helpful. Law of diminishing returns. The more crazy you get with something, less effective you become. You take some time off, downtime. Relationship with your leaders. I should probably do a separate church conundrum thing about this, is how to disagree with the leader in a way that's consistent with Christ-like principles. Paul wasn't very good at this, as we read in Acts about the sharp contention he had, and with this confrontation, there's a different way to engage leaders. How are you handling changes in the church? And it was the law of Moses. Are we using the correct name of the church? Is that still an issue with you? What about the high priest in having to meet an elders quorum? Were you becoming a bunch of snobs in the high priest group, and now that you have to hang around with elders, that's a problem for you? Yeah, just think about that. The office of high priest won't do any good if you're not following the direction of the presiding high priest, who is the president of the church, and the great high priest, who is Christ. Lastly, do you understand what it means to have Christ formed in you? You're becoming Christ-like. It's an odd analogy. It's like being pregnant with Christ is kind of the thing if you misunderstand it. But Paul's driving at something. He's teaching us about becoming Christ-like. It's not a set of rules or behaviors. It's a transformation of your nature. This is what Joseph Smith taught. Through the atonement of Christ and the resurrection obedience to the gospel, we shall again be conformed to the image of his Son. Be conformed to the image of his Son, having Christ formed in you, getting his image, being assimilated into his likeness. Then we shall have attained to the image, glory, and character of God. That's from chapter 3 of the Joseph Smith Manual. You think about this, study about what it's to have Christ formed in you, not mastering Christ-like behaviors, but taking the character and having the image of Christ engraven upon your countenance. That's exaltation. That's what's being talked about there. It's in there. We can see it clearer because of the revelations from Joseph Smith. Don't shy away from it. To shy away from the doctrine of exaltation is to shy away from Christ. We need to stick with Christ. And sticking with Christ, that's the point.